I think sometimes it's easy for us to forget exactly what was done on our behalf. So before we get into this week's lesson, which really deals with this whole idea of Jesus being sent on his way to crucifixion, let's just do a quick review. Last week we understand that the priesthood carried out a plan for Jesus' death. This is what they've been thinking about for a year. You may remember this. They've been plotting to kill him for some time. We also learned, I say last week, well, whatever it was when we last went through John, which was chapter 18, that there was hope for Peter. He was somebody who said, no, I don't know what to do. And yet, he repented. Jesus redeemed him. There's hope for him. There's hope for us. So we understand, too, that Jesus, he's been up all night. He sees Pilate about 6 o'clock in the morning. So this is a new daylight time. Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. This was part of the contention. Jesus' kingdom isn't brought by force. It's not brought by violence. He was no threat to Rome. And this was part of Pilate's dilemma. And we also understand that truth is God's kingdom, his righteousness, and that true Christians, true Christ followers who have devoted themselves in body, mind, spirit, everything, well, we take heed to his truth. We listen and we put those things into practice. So what about today? Well, today we're going to cover John chapter 19, verses 1 through 16. We're going to look at Jesus' scourging and his presentation as a mocked king. We're going to also consider Pilate's dilemma. Now, I'm not going to throw him alone. I'm not saying that I feel sorry for him. But he was in a really tough spot, as we're going to find out. And then we'll also cover Jesus' sentencing. Now, the crucifixion itself, as a consequence of the sentencing, we'll cover next week. Some important points that I want you to walk away with today. I'm going to teach you something about Roman flogging. You might think, well, it's just a bit, actually, there were 3 kinds of flogging. The fustigation, or the fustigatio, which was the least severe. It'd be like a little whipping with a whip, a couple of lashes, and don't do that again, right? That was that kind of a whipping. This is what Jesus would have gotten first, as we're going to see today. But also, I want you to remember that nothing happens that God doesn't either instigate or allow to happen. He is sovereign. There's no doubt about it. He chooses not to intervene in our lives at times, not to stop evil when it happens. We live in a broken world. But at the end of the day, God is God. You also want to understand that Pilate is extremely afraid. He's in a weird spot because his wife, Claudia, has a vision that really has kind of gotten him shaken. Plus, he's in danger here of being called an enemy of Caesar. He's got to think carefully about what he does. Interestingly enough, too, today you'll find that the Jews at that point, not only did they reject Jesus, but they disown God. No, we have no king but Caesar. And yet, who's the rightful king of Israel? God. And then also we'll learn that Jesus is crucified with the other sacrificial lambs on Passover preparation day. All right, so what is the purpose of John's text here? It should be pretty clear. I'm sure you did your homework. You already know all this. This is Jesus' trial. This is where Pilate gets to ask him a lot of questions. He's sent to Herod. He's brought back. And then his sentence. Now, interestingly enough, and you're not going to realize this unless you compare all the gospel accounts together. Jesus is sent to Pilate, brought to Pilate. And Pilate says, what? The guy's not guilty? And so Pilate sends him to Herod, because Herod's the king of the Jews. Let the king of the Jews take care of this, right? You say this is the guy saying he's the king of the Jews. Let's send him to the real king of the Jews, Herod. Herod gets him, and Herod goes, whatever, hooks him with a robe, sends him back to Pilate. So he goes back and forth a couple of times. I think it's really important to remember this. And even then, Pilate still says, I didn't find anything about him. Herod didn't find any guilt in him. The guy's not guilty. But there's more to the story. So what is this? This is Thursday morning, the 14th of Nisan, and we're in the Roman Praetorium. And I'll explain what that is in just a minute. All right, let's start here with the scourging. So in case you're wondering, I'm in John chapter 19, and we're going to start with verse 1. Pilate then took Jesus and he scourged him. Now, in chapter 18, verse 38, Pilate said that Jesus was innocent. Let me read this to you. Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And then when he had said this, he went out to the Jews and said, "I find no guilt in him." This is where we left off. Now the flogging, the scourging that he's about to get is the least severe. It's that first one I told you about, the fustigatio. And so, but this is just a meager attempt to set Jesus free. Pilate doesn't want to deal with this. So, okay, let's whip him a little bit, and then that'll satisfy things. But that's not the case. He doesn't understand that nothing but death will do. In fulfilling God's promise and fulfilling the prophecies, only death will do, but the Jews cannot sentence him to death. It's going to take Pilate. So Pilate's not done. So anyway, let me tell you a little bit more about these floggings real quick before we continue. The first one, fustigatio, is a less severe beating meted out for things like if you're a hooligan. I don't know, let's just say that Jared decided to have an interesting night out in the town, and they catch him, they bring him in. Okay, he's a ruffian. All right, 10 lashes and the fustigatio with a whip, and tell him don't do this again, and send him along on his way. That's the first one. This is the one that Jesus likely received first, because Pilate's just trying to placate the Jews and get Jesus out of there. Then there's the next one, the flagellation. Now you've heard of this, you've seen this, right? Movies or stories of the monks, where they're whipping their back, because they feel guilty or something. They feel this is a way to do penance for things that they've done in the past. But this is a little bit more brutal. It's not extremely brutal. It's not going to kill you, but it's going to make you think. And so this is for criminals who have done more serious crimes. This is not what Jesus would have gotten at this point, because he hasn't really been convicted of anything yet. Pilate just wants to make a point. Now the third one, the verberatio, is the most brutal one. And this is what you saw a clip of just a moment ago. And this is the one that Jesus ends up getting on his way to the cross. And we'll cover that in a little bit more detail later and also next week. I'm going to read one commentary that describes this verberatio. This is the terrible scourging, most terrible scourging of them all, and one that was always associated with other punishments, including crucifixion. In this last form, the victim was stripped, tied to a post, and then beaten by several torturers. In the Roman provinces, they were soldiers, like you saw here, and they were beaten until they were exhausted, or their commanding officers called them off. For victims who, like Jesus, were neither Roman citizens nor soldiers, the favorite instrument was a whip, whose leather thongs were fitted with pieces of bone, or lead, or other metal. The beatings were often so savage that the victims died. So this is why we see that Jesus is too weak to carry his cross. He's lost so much blood. It's because of this beating, which is going to come a little bit later. So again, Jesus first gets his least severe fustigatio, and it's just meant to appease the Jews. Now, in case you're going, well, how do you know this? Well, we can kind of glean this from scriptures, but we also understand at this point, Herod has seen Jesus and put a robe on him and sent him back. If Jesus had been that bloody, as we know he ends up being, this would not have worked. It wouldn't have allowed itself to take a fancy robe, put it on Jesus, take it off. It really wouldn't have been valuable enough to then split by the soldiers. So this verberatio is coming, but it is not yet. And so why was it important to give Jesus this kind of a beating? Why was it important to break the legs of the people on the cross, as we'll read about next week? Well, this crucifixion had to be hurried up. Think about this. Passover. It was a high Sabbath. This is Thursday day, Thursday night. The 15th of Nisan is when Passover, the feast, began. And by Jewish law, nobody could remain hanging, no Jew could remain hanging on a tree after sunset as a result. So they had to hurry this up. Otherwise, sometimes these people sat on the cross or hung on the cross for days until they just finally couldn't take it anymore. Let's go ahead and move into verses 2 and 3. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns, and they put it on his head and a purple robe on him. And they began to come up to him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews," and give him slaps in the face. Now here's Matthew's account of this crowning and the mocking by the soldiers. This is from Matthew 27 to 31. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and after twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed on his right hand, and they knelt down before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him and took the reed and began to beat him on the head. And after they had mocked him, they took off the scarlet robe, and they put his own garments back on him, and they led him away to crucify him. So what we see here is barracks vulgarity. These are just basic, simple infantry, military men. And they're just having some fun, well, in basic military form. So first of all, what about the crown? When you look up here at this crown, you kind of get the idea. It's likely made of 12-inch long thorns from the date palm. So now what we have is we've got mocking and beating, that whipping, and then the beating by the stick with these military guys and the taunts and the mocks. And now we've got blood and pain from this crown that's placed on his head. And the blood running down into his eyes. And he's having to deal with all of this all at the same time. The worst is yet to come, but it can't be pleasant. Plus he's been up all the previous day and all night in prayer. So one of the things that's important to understand is that Jesus is not led directly to the cross at this point, because he still hasn't been to Herod. At least I don't think he's been to Herod yet. He still needs to undergo more scrutiny by Pilate. And then you have to remember that there comes a time when he goes, well, all right, so who do you want me to free, Barabbas or Jesus? Well, that hasn't happened yet. So these things must come. So Jesus is just getting this light flogging, and then, and then he's going to go to Herod. So this colorful robe, by the way, we have a couple of candidates, and I think I just probably led us down a weird rabbit trail. There are two likely candidates for this robe. It's either a military robe, one of the soldiers' robes. They put it on Jesus, took it off. This is probably the case. It could also have been the gorgeous robe from Herod, but I don't think he's been to Herod yet. We're going to talk about this later. Let's go ahead and go to verses 4 through 6. Pilate came out again and said to them, behold, I am bringing him out so that you may know that I find no guilt in him. Remember, he's had the light flogging. And then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, behold, the man. So when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, crucify, crucify. And Pilate said, take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. So in the praetorium, he's got this light flogging, he's got this crown of thorns on his head. They send him back out to the Jews. Okay, there, see. How about that? I don't find any fault in him. He's got a little bit of a punishment, whatever. And they keep yelling, crucify, crucify. And he says, well, do it yourself. Well, he knows that they can't do it themselves, so he's mocking them in a sense. And also notice this. He said, here's the man. Now, that's kind of interesting, because really, in a sense, he's mocking them further. Here's the dangerous guy that you want me to kill. Look at him. And we could also take this a bit further if we wanted to. Here is the man who is the Word. The one that was with us from the beginning. This is the one that John opens his gospel with. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so we understand this man is the Word. Now, Pilate doesn't understand this. At this point, he's mocking. But at the end of the day, the Jews will have their way. Let's go ahead and move into verses 7 through 11. Jews answered him, we have a law, and by that law he ought to die because he made himself out to be the Son of God. Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. And he entered into the praetorium again, and he said to Jesus, where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, you do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the authority to release you, and I have authority to crucify you? And Jesus answered, you have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above. And for this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin. So first of all, let me tell you what a praetorium is. You ever see these movies where it's maybe back in the Roman times and there's a Roman general and he's got this giant tent and all of his guys hang out and they seem to be drinking and eating well under the tent while the soldiers are fighting and doing their thing? This is the praetorium. This is where the military authority issues its orders. This is where judgment comes from. It's just that now it's not a tent in this case, it's actually a building in Jerusalem where Pilate, who's the authority, the governor, gets to issue his judgment from. So this is the praetorium. So one of the things I'll tell you at this point, because it may not be so obvious, the Jews' strategy is failing. What did they say? They came in and tried to claim this guy's an insurrectionist. He's a troublemaker. He's an insurrectionist. This is a political thing. And that's not working. So then they decide to change their approach. So they decide to make it a religious thing. So they say, oh, well, wait a minute. He made himself out to be the king of the Jews. So it isn't just that he's a troublemaker. He's making himself out to be the king. So Pilate goes back into the praetorium. And he's afraid because he doesn't know where Jesus is from. And now he's got this kingship, this religious thing to deal with. And also his fears are going to be deepened because of his wife Claudia's vision. She has a vision, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So Pilate's in a weird spot because he has to keep the peace. This is his big job right now. It's Passover time. There are a lot of insurrectionists in the area. Typically this is a time of rioting. And so he's got to keep the peace. He's trying to figure out how to best do this. Well, this guy's done nothing wrong. I don't really want to harm him. I don't want to punish him. But on the other hand, these guys are getting pretty tipped off. So he's got to maintain the law. So what law is this, by the way? Let me spend a moment telling you about this. What law? The Jews said, hey, we've got a law, right? And you're supposed to keep the peace here. So here's the law. It refers not to the Torah as a whole, but one law within the Torah. Leviticus 24:16, and I'll just read it to you. Anyone who blasphemes the name of the Lord must be put to death. It's pretty serious. So Pilate's really afraid at this point. Okay, great. This guy's got to be put to death, but I don't see that there's an issue here. There's another thing you have to remember, that Romans believed in a lot of different gods and were very superstitious people. So he's got a superstitious underpinning. He's got his job to keep the peace. And he's got these Jews telling him that, hey, this guy should be put to death according to our law. What are you going to do about it? So at this point, Jesus is in there. He doesn't answer because he's told Pilate all that he can. There's nothing more to say. There's nothing more that Pilate would understand. So Jesus remains silent. That's it. So this authority, by the way, of God is very interesting. Jesus tells him first, hey, you're only allowed to do what you're doing because God says it's okay. I'm paraphrasing, right? So here's, again, verse 11. Jesus answered, you would have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above. God is sovereign. He directs some events and he allows others. If nothing else, he chooses not to stop some of the evil that happens in a broken world. Would you agree? If he wanted to, he could. He is God. He is sovereign. He is the Lord that we've devoted ourselves to and serve. Also, this is very interesting. In God's sovereignty, he often uses good what other people mean for evil. In other words, he often uses the evil stuff that people plan for good purposes. Sounds weird, but let me read to you from Genesis 50, 19 through 20. You might understand, that Joseph's brothers tried to kill him, but they really can't bring themselves to do it. They beat him up, throw him in a pit, right? And then they sell him off to some slave traders. So they meant this thing for evil. But God used it for good. Out of this, Joseph was in Egypt, and he was able to basically kick off this sequence of events to the Exodus. So it was a good thing. So this is Genesis 50, 19 through 20. Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I not in God's place? As I said for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. That there was a time of great famine. So we also see a reiteration of this part of John's Gospel in the Acts of the Holy Spirit, where nothing happens that God doesn't permit. In Acts 4, 27 through 28, for truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your purpose predestined to occur. God wins. So verse 11 continues. Jesus says, for this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin. Well, who is he? Who delivered Jesus to be killed for this evil purpose that will be used for good? Well, let's talk about that. We don't know his identity, but it could be a couple of people. You might say, well, it's Judas, because Judas betrayed Jesus. He's the one. Well, he could be, but here's the challenge with that. We don't see Judas having any part of this plot against Jesus and his sentencing and death. Really, in fact, he ends up hanging himself. So, okay, he did betray Jesus, but he's not really the one that delivered Jesus over to this death sentence. On the other hand, we've got Caiaphas. Caiaphas could be the best candidate. Why? Because he's the one that takes Jesus, and he takes a very active part in this, doesn't he? He's the one that's plotting. It seems good that one man perish, and he kicks this plan into motion, and he takes Jesus, and he sends him to Pilate. Caiaphas is the one who delivered him for this sentencing, this judgment. So, just in case you're wondering, well, who's the he who delivered me? Jesus speaking. Well, probably Caiaphas. So what does God give Pilate authority over? We say, well, yeah, he gave him authority. But authority to do what? What in particular? And really, it's probably the entire betrayal itself. Everything that happened, the time Judas betrayed Jesus, up until the time that Jesus is sentenced and taken and hung on the cross, God had given Pilate the authority to execute that. It's the entire sequence of events. Let's go ahead and move to verse 12. As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him. See, Pilate still wants to release Jesus. He's afraid, and this guy's done nothing wrong. But the Jews cried out, saying, if you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar. So now the Jews, they try a third option here because things aren't working so well. The political sedition isn't working. The religious thing isn't working. Pilate doesn't care. He's not Jewish. But what could work? Hey, this guy says he's king, so only Caesar's king. If you let him go, you're agreeing with him, and you're no friend of Caesar. Well, now Pilate's got an issue. This is not good. They pit him against the emperor, and that gets Pilate's attention. So, Pilate's got to be in a really weird situation here. But remember, only Pilate can sentence Jesus to death, and so now these Jews have to manipulate Pilate to carry out their purpose. It's very interesting at this point that essentially they deny Christ, they deny God. As we'll see as this thing plays out here. But Pilate has no choice but to condemn Jesus because, well, if he doesn't, then he, in a sense, is saying, yeah, here's your king. It's a king that the emperor did not ordain. Let's go ahead and move into verses 13 through 26. Sorry, 13 to 16. Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought up Jesus, and he sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. And now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, behold your king. So they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? And the chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. So then he handed him over to be crucified. So now we're on track with this brutal verbatim flogging that you saw part of a clip of at the beginning of this. The crucifixion will follow. But I need to introduce Claudia at this point. Who's Claudia? And excuse me. And what's the big deal here? Now he had a dream. In fact, so he's afraid at this point. His wife has said, "Have nothing to do with this man. I saw this in a vision last night." In fact, let me read to you from Matthew 27:19, because John doesn't report this, but Matthew does. While he, Pilate, was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him a message saying, "I have nothing to do with that righteous man, for last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him." So Pilate is sitting on this judgment seat. He's about to execute judgment against Jesus, and he's already in a bad spot anyway. And then he gets a message from his wife, "Hey, back off. I had a dream. This is not going to end well." I'm sure that's what she said. And so he's in a really bad place. But who is Claudia? So she's his wife, and the best we can figure, her name was Claudia Procula. So there's just little known about her. But she gets Pilate's attention, but what can he do? So again, he's in a really weird place because there's threat of retaliation by Caesar. And so now we're back to the charge of sedition against the emperor. Jesus claims to be a king. The emperor didn't make him king. Therefore, he's going to be put to death. Let's take a look at verse 14. Another look. Now it was the day of preparation for Passover. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." So again, he's still being kind of sarcastic. So the day of preparation was the day, Thursday, Nisan 14, before the Passover, which would begin at sundown. And next week we'll take another look at that timeline. At sundown, Nisan 15, the day of Passover, the Feast of Passover would begin. So now that during the day on Thursday, the lambs, sacrificial lambs, are going to be slaughtered in preparation for that time. This isn't a normal Sabbath and a normal Sabbath preparation. This is a high Sabbath because it is one of the feasts, and so it's called a high Sabbath, and its preparation was the slaughtering of the lambs. So what about the 6th hour? When would this be? Well, typically, the day, if you remember the reckoning of time in the Jewish time frame, about sundown, say about 6 o'clock at night to 6 in the morning was evening. and 6 in the morning to 6 at night was morning. So evening, morning. In other words, night and day. And so if you say the 6th hour, you go 6 hours from 6 a.m., we're looking at about noon. So high noon. In verse 15, Pilate continues to mock the Jews. Shall I crucify your king? Now he knows that they don't like this, right? They're not going to take well to this. So this actually though invites blasphemy by the chief priests. And they say this. Now they're accusing Jesus of blasphemy. But here they go, we have no king but Caesar. But Hebrew scriptures repeatedly insist that God is the only true king of Israel. They only have one king, and that's God himself. So essentially what they've done is they've rejected God as their king again. Have they done this before? I'm going to share with you one time. I'm going to ask you the question, give you a moment to ponder, and then we'll answer the question. Have they ever in their history rejected God as their king? And the answer is yes, once before. So after God brought them out of Egypt by Moses, who ruled? Judges, right? They had judges. And these judges ruled. There was a hierarchy, and God was king. But then what happened?
We wanted to be like the other nations that had a king.
Exactly. They wanted to look like their pagan counterparts. They wanted a human king, and so they chose Saul. So they rejected God as their king. Now they've done it again. So now he's been sentenced, and he's about to receive this really, really violent verberatio, flogging, and where he loses a lot of blood, and he's very weak, and then he has to carry his cross member. That happens next week. So let's go ahead and provide a quick summary, and we'll get you guys out for lunch. So nothing but Jesus' death will appease the religious Jews. Not the light whipping, the fustigavio, that's not going to cut it. Nothing but death. But little do they know that only death will accomplish God's purposes too. There are 3 kinds of floggings: the fustigation, the light one, the flagellation, the medium one for more serious crimes like maybe you robbed somebody perhaps, or for the really serious criminals, especially on their way to crucifixion, the verberatio. So Jesus likely received that light one first, and then he's going to receive next week, when we go through the rest of this chapter, the more serious verberatio. Now Pilate is very, very afraid at this point because they've pitted him against Caesar. He has no choice but to condemn Jesus for something he doesn't think Jesus is guilty of. And his wife is telling him, don't do that because this is going to be a problem and a dream. He's got his wife on the one side, don't do that. He's got the Jews, do it. And he's caught right in the middle. So I do feel for him a little bit in that regard. But at the end of the day, he says he wipes his hands clean of it. They're the ones that condemned him to death, even though they didn't really have the right to. But he's afraid. The Jews reject Christ and they reject God as their king. I don't know if they realized it at that moment what they had done. That's indeed what they had done. And it's never been well ever since. But it will one day. There's a time coming. So Jesus is crucified along with the other sacrificial lambs on the preparation day of the Passover, which is a high Sabbath. So what about the challenge? There always has to be one, because there's no point in really reading Scripture unless we put it to use somehow. It's got to change us. Everything that we read and we meditate on and we pray about regard to the Scriptures, it has to change us. It has to transform us. It has to do something. Or what's it really doing? What's its value if it's not changing us? So let's think about this for a moment. Who's my king? Would I be quick to reject Christ? And before you go, oh no, I would never do that. Take a moment. Maybe we do that when we walk away from God's ways, when we practice sinful behavior. In a sense, are we rejecting God as our King, our Lord? Now we say that Christ is Lord, that God is King. Well, in that case, we should be a slave to Him, not to sin. Well, if we're a slave to sin, then God isn't our King. Would you agree? So I think that we may do this more than we think we do. We should always ask that question. Remember that we do devote ourselves. We are servants to the risen Savior, because he loved us first. He gave first. He sacrificed. He took the beatings. He died for us. He was in the ground. God kept a promise, raising from the dead. That one sacrifice for all when we believe and follow, when we consume for that relationship. Next week, please read John chapter 19, verses 17 to 42, because we're going to discuss the crucifixion itself. And I really love this. Not the crucifixion itself. I mean, it's a horrible way to die. However, I think that you're going to enjoy this too, because we get to see a lot of prophecies out of Psalm 22 fulfilled. So what I'd like you to do, and please do this, because we're supposed to be studying and reading and working together on this throughout the week. Read John 19, 17 to 42. In other words, read the rest of the chapter. But I want you to also read Psalm 22. And I think that you'll understand what I'm talking about. And if you don't, you will next week.